Welcome. It looks like people are starting to come in from the waiting room. Welcome, welcome everyone. You should be able to hear me talking right now, and there's some tips for getting settled into Zoom on your screen that you should be seeing. So turn up the volume if you can't hear me. That's kind of on your end of how that volume sounds. And the buttons for the microphone and the camera are in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. And so you don't need to have your camera on right now. But later, if you want to have your camera on during your breakout room, you're welcome to do that. You're also welcome to have it on now. But make sure you're familiar with where those are. If this Zoom window has taken over your whole screen, hit the escape button on your computer, on your actual keyboard, and that will shrink the window back down to something that you can resize and move around. Chat is open, so if you would like to say hello to friends old and new, you can go into the chat and you can give a chat out to everyone, or you can click on that blue everyone bubble and there's a down arrow next to it, and you can actually see the names of the people who are in the session, and if you recognize anyone, you can chat them directly. If you have a space that you're working in today that is less than ideal and you are willing to have your camera on but don't want to show your background, there are virtual backgrounds in Zoom. If you want some tips on how to use those virtual backgrounds, you can ask us, and we will put out a slide that shows really quickly how to get in there. If you need technical assistance, Patrick Moyle is running the tech on behind this session, so you can see him there. If you need anything and you don't want to ask in front of everyone, you're welcome to chat Patrick directly, and that will he'll do everything he can to get you squared away tech-wise. It looks like we still have a few people who are joining from the waiting room, so let's give them another minute or so. Typically what I find with the Zoom webinars, it takes a couple minutes for everyone to get connected, and especially folks might be joining and then not have their audio connected, so oftentimes people are able to join first with video, but their audio comes in a few seconds later. So it'll take a few seconds to get everyone in there. Again, the slide on the screen just helps you get settled into the Zoom platform. If it's your first Zoom meeting, expect that you'll have a bit of a learning curve. So if you're feeling like you're struggling or you're joining on your phone for the first time and are used to joining on a laptop or a tablet, that also will look a little bit different. If you came in with a weird name or not a name, you can change your name by clicking on the participants button. And when you click on the participants button, you'll see a sidebar with the participants. And if you go to your line in that, you can click on it and rename yourself. On a phone, you click on it and there's a drop-down menu. And on a tablet, there's a more button, and then there's a down arrow to rename yourself. All right, it looks like most folks are settled in, and it seems like everyone has a name, which is great. That will be really helpful later. Is the waiting room clear, Patrick?
Yes, it is.
Okay, great. All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. So welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We are having the chat open this whole meeting, so if at any point in time you need to chat out something to either one of us or to someone else in the meeting, you're welcome to do that. We'll be using chat today to share some URLs, some internet links. And so if you have the most recent version of Zoom, those are changing background in Zoom is super easy. Patrick, can you bounce us up to the very first slide in the slide deck? That's how you do it. So right next to your start video button, there's an upward arrow. It's just one of the choices in there. Choose virtual background, and then when you get there, Zoom has some preloaded ones. If you don't want to use a preloaded background in the future, you are welcome to upload your own picture. So if you look at Gina, Gina has her own custom backdrop there. It looks like Pam also does. She's got a video behind her. She's really living it up. It can really change your perspective on yourself. So it's very, very easy to do. All right, so back to the slides. So chat is open. So yeah, we will try to respond to questions that you ask in the chat, questions like that. And we'll be pasting internet links in. So if you have the newest version of Zoom in the chat window, those show up as hyperlinks and you can click on them and then it jumps you to that in your browser. If you don't have the newest version of Zoom, as in the one that came out today, you might not have that capability. So you'll need to select that whole link and copy and paste it in your browser manually. So I think that pretty much sets us up for being able to use the Zoom platform. So let's get started with the session. I'm Jennifer Folsom. I'm the lead learning architect with STEM's Making Sense of Science group at WestEd. And I'll be facilitating today along with Patrick Moyle. He is a professional learning specialist with the Making Sense of Science project. And Patrick and I have been working with a group of principals and lead teachers throughout your region since last November. Lordsburg, Deming, Reserve, and Hatch. And we have thoroughly enjoyed working with them and getting to come to Deming, Lordsburg, and Hatch. We've been to all of the schools in all the elementary schools in those districts and seen a lot of the classrooms. And we have been focusing on science implementation. So your work with implementing the New Mexico STEM Ready Science Standards. And when COVID-19 hit, we obviously stopped traveling to your region and we didn't want to bring you any of our germs. So we stopped traveling and we decided we would just pivot our work and try to support the region with the challenge that you're currently experiencing, which is COVID-19. So our project is part of a larger group at WestEd, and we have a lot of different groups that work in different areas. And so we have pivoted our work to look a little bit more at distance learning. And we're not losing the science lens completely. We are thinking specifically about how to support science distance learning. But in this session, it is a general support on distance learning. We'll briefly set the stage for the mindset that we use in our approach to distance learning during COVID-19, which is not the same mindset we use when we're having a purposeful, planned transition to distance learning outside of this context. And then the main course for today is designing distance learning. And so this is getting into the kind of nitty-gritty of how you design it, both from a pedagogical standpoint and then also a tech support standpoint, because distance learning, those two things are not separable. And then we'll be doing some reflections and content processing. And after the session, we're going to stick around for casual Q&A. So if you have specific questions about the distance learning work you're doing in your context, maybe you have a specific course or something that you're working on, you can ask Patrick and I those things as well. So we're going to begin today with a quick poll to get a feel for who's joined us today. And when you answer this poll in Zoom, a screen will pop up on your window. You can click your answer. There are 3 questions. So when I see it pop up from Patrick on my screen, I see just the first 2 questions. So I have to scroll down to get to the third. Click on whatever answer is true for you. What grade band do you work with? And then as you click, we see the tally of the votes coming in. And once we've gotten a fair number of people voting, then we will share the results. So go ahead and mark what grade band you work with, where are you at with distance learning, and what challenges are your students facing. And that one is select all. So you can add as many to that one as you want. Here we have about half of the people who voted, and it's been under a minute. So as a perspective on how long it takes to do a poll, in general, it takes about 2 minutes for people to get settled and get in there and do their voting. All right, let's give it a few more seconds, but I'm gonna, all right, it looks like we've settled. Not everyone is able to vote, depending on how they come in. So it's possible that people are unable to vote. So it's unlikely if you do a poll in a Zoom session that you'll get every one of your attendees to vote. So I'm gonna end the poll and then I'm gonna share the results. And so just so everyone has a feel for who's on the call, and we have about half of the people who are in pre-K through grade 5, a few folks from high school. And then in our other category, I think that we have a PED representative who is here. We have several folks from the Southwest REC in Deming who have joined. If you're another person besides those two groups, you're welcome to chat out what your other status is. The same is true for the second question. I am very happy to see that most of you are managing okay. I sometimes think that's the best case scenario right now. So congratulations. If you're managing okay, I call that a big win. A couple folks are struggling, and so hopefully this is helpful, and you should feel free to stick around during the Q&A. And if there's any specific tools we can help you with, we'll do that. People who are listed as an other for number 2, if you want to chat out where you're at with that, that is helpful. And then as we look at the challenges that students are facing, this is probably the most interesting part of the poll, to really see what the challenges are across the region. So by and large, everyone's having challenges, but the need devices and internet has been the highest rated one of all the polls that I have done kind of across the board with this series. And so it's really common everywhere. That doesn't make it any easier, but it is a common challenge. And it is stressful at home and we miss each other. Like, all those things are true. It's kind of reassuring to me, actually, that there's not so many votes on the "we need help with technology." So give yourselves a pat on the back for that. And that's an excellent thing. So if there are other challenges, at least four people voted that there were some other challenges that weren't mentioned here. So if you want to use the chat to share those, you are welcome to chat out what some of those other challenges were. All right, so the first thing that we want to say right now is that what you're doing right now, this crisis distance learning, it's not like any other distance learning effort that has ever happened. And so all those other efforts were guided by research, they were gradual, they were all mixed with face-to-face work, either among the participants, between the participants and the instructor, or at least between instructors, or at some level there was mixing. And we weren't isolated at home trying to pull it off. Imagine how different it would be when you were instituting your distance learning program if you were at school and could sit down as colleagues and do that. So there's nothing normal about this transition. And so if you go out there and you look at the researches and best practices of distance learning, some of them are not going to apply right now because this is a different context. So just keep that in perspective. So if you see something out there and it feels like solid research and a good recommendation, and you think to yourself, there's no way I could do that right now, that's to be expected. So based on that difference, we've put together a flyer with principles for distance learning during COVID. And some of these principles are different from the best practice recommendations for distance learning. And they all are related to the research on trauma-informed instruction. So this COVID isolation is going to be a traumatic experience for many people. And what we want to do during this experience is help people move towards resilience with that trauma, rather than making them become more and more vulnerable to that trauma. So we want to set up our distance learning so that we enable them to be resilient to the trauma. And so when we think about adverse childhood experiences, or ACE points or ACE scores, if that's something you're familiar with in terms of the social, emotional learning and mental health of students, we don't want every student who comes back this summer or fall to have another point on their ACE score. These trauma points, these traumatic childhood experiences have a really big impact on what happens in the classroom. So we don't want our distance learning to do that. So we want to be real sensitive about that. We actually want to change learning goals and the learning process. We know the process is going to change. We can't see each other. But we also need to change the goals, because what students can accomplish in their homes with or without their parents around, and with or without their other siblings around, and babies around, and all the things that are happening, and the stress of households who don't have income coming in right now. We want to change the learning goals for those kids, not just the process. We can't hold them to the same level of expectation. It doesn't mean we don't want them to learn or to achieve or to make progress, but we want to change those goals. And then we want to design for the distance environment. So all of you who have curriculum at school, that's great. It might work great in your classroom. If you find yourself looking at it and saying, how am I going to transfer this to distance learning? Maybe it's not the right thing to do. Maybe it's okay to let go of your classroom curriculum and use a different activity, a different curriculum that's already well matched to the distance environment. So if you're using a science textbook, for example, in K-5, maybe you switch to mystery science because that's already all online. And so you don't have to do the work of transitioning an in-person product to the online environment. You can just take something that was made for online, and it could save your sanity, and it might be easier for your learners as well. Of course, we're all preparing for our students' upcoming challenges, but oftentimes what we're doing is preparing for these immediate challenges that are happening now. And we're encouraging people to continue to do that, but to think a little bit farther ahead. What's summer going to look like for your students? What's fall going to look like? Not just in terms of academics, but if they're in their houses for 3 months, how is their context different than it is now when they've only been at home for a few weeks, right? So how will that change, and what will their needs be as time goes on? We also are asking people to not only investigate their district policies or their institutional policies, but if you're passionate about them or you don't like them, to get involved in helping make them and revise them. So the state has put out some recommendations, districts have put out recommendations, but classroom teachers, you're frontline workers. You are essential workers on the front line of the pandemic, and you are often the ones who have the best advice on policies. And so to push up and help everyone else who's a little bit farther away from the students understand where they are and influence policies. And the very last one is I guess a silver lining. We're pretty good instructors in our classrooms for the most part, right? Most days things go well. We're happy with how things went. We tweak a few things here and there. And our kids really look up to us. They think we're sort of magical, right? And in the distance space, most of us are not that. So most of us are going to try things out right now and fail. This won't work, that won't work, my Zoom session is this, they're all changing their backgrounds, right? And you are kind of failing on the spot in front of your kids. And you know what? It's the perfect opportunity to show them what a successful adult does when they encounter failure, and a skill that we want to teach them. And we want to give out grace for ourselves in this transition and also for the kids. So those are the principles of distance learning, and there are a ton of resources out there about how to do distance learning right now. And as a parent myself, I have found myself a bit overwhelmed with the endless web of resources to search. So we have spent some time curating a Google Doc with links that we think specifically are helpful for your region. And so we've been working with this leadership cadre group. We've been to your schools, and we tried to put together a document that would be a little bit more curated than just these giant web sources. So the very first one is really the only content that we're putting out there, and it's Wide Open School. It's a repository of content. Part of the reason we picked it is it's super easy to access, and it has all the big names and online stuff in it, so you're not searching around. And they did a brilliant job with the website design so that you can search by category which includes grade, if you're a family, if you're a teacher. And they have an English language learner section. They call it an ESL section. And they have a lot of really good resources in there, which are hard to find on the internet. And so that one really spoke to us because we worked so much with your English language learners while we were there. The other big issues we've been hearing about is social emotional, really attending to that dimension of the learning. There's a lot of different pieces in there. The Aunt Bertha website provides a list of services based on zip code. There's internet access information in there. There's a domestic violence flyer here. That's something that we've seen all through the country, really the rate of domestic violence going up in this isolation. And so that might be of use. A mental health article. And so there's a variety of things there. And then there are some tools for video recording because people have asked about recording videos rather than having live meetings. And then the two platforms that we've seen people using a lot, Zoom and Google, there's information from those. And because we're a science group, we have tips for science online and science offline. And that, I think, is a particularly important part of thinking about distance learning resources, because most of the resources that are out there are in English language arts and math. And if those are not your kids' favorite subjects, science is often a really well-loved subject. And if they're not doing their schoolwork in ELA and math, sometimes we can get them engaged in science. And so that may be a venue to look at as you go forth. As we design distance learning, it's really helpful to think about some of the specific pieces that are in there. And there is a, go ahead and jump one more for me, Patrick. As we look in there, it's really helpful to keep in mind how people learn. So this was a classroom from one of the schools in your region, and it was so obvious in this room how much teachers were building on kids' existing experiences. Look at how engaged those kids are. Look at all those hands that are up. Those kids were motivated because the lesson was relevant and they had choice and they were able to collaborate with each other and talk to each other. And we are doing a great job really thinking about how people learn in our classrooms, and we need to keep doing that when we move into this distance learning space. So in addition to thinking about how people learn, we have to do two things as distance educators. And one is to boost engagement, and the other one is to minimize roadblocks. So you want to make it so your kids can access their distance learning, but you also want to make it so they really want to do that distance learning, because you're not there to encourage them to do it, right? There's no social pressure. There's, none of their friends are at the table working. So we have to do these two things. And every day I ask myself, what am I doing to boost engagement in my presentations? What am I doing in my activity choices to boost engagement? And how am I minimizing roadblocks so my learners can actually participate and learn something? So to help with some of these other logistics, like beyond this framework about distance learning, there's a flyer that we put together, and you'll get all the links to these flyers. I assume Patrick's putting them in the chat because I wasn't reading it. Yep. But all these flyers you're able to print out and share around. This next one, this list of bullets here, those are the topics that are covered in this next flyer. And those are all things that we do in our classrooms, right? We give demos, we collect an exit ticket, we make content collaboratively, like we have small groups make charts, things like that. You can do all those at distance too. And at first it feels like you can't. And this document really goes through, well, if you want to do that, what could it look like at distance? And there's a list of examples for each one of those types of things you do in the classroom. And it's not all synchronous Zoom meetings as the answer. So there are a variety of tools that you can use that will get to those same classroom activities. So maybe it happens in a Zoom call, maybe it doesn't. Maybe it happens by chat on a phone. Maybe it happens in an offline chat. Maybe this is a totally kind of asynchronous, they do it on their own time activity. There's a lot of different choices in that document. So I encourage folks to read through that one if you're feeling like, this is my favorite thing to do and I haven't figured out how to do it in the distance space. This has tips for that. And it's both at the pedagogical level and also the tool level. So it tells you how to do it and it tells you what tool you might use to do it with. So thinking about the work that you do, you heard me use the term asynchronous learning. This is synchronous learning, meaning we're all in the same place at the same time. We kept this one short because that's more practical right now. The challenges with synchronous learning right now are huge. So if we have trouble with internet access, that's a big challenge and it can cause hardship. So if that's the only way we're sharing content or doing content processing, for students who aren't able to join, that's an unnecessary hardship on their end. And that's a really big challenge right now. Asynchronous has fewer challenges, but it really suffers when the engagement level isn't high. So if you're sending home packets and it's all asynchronous and they're just supposed to work on their own, those packets have to be incredibly engaging if they're going to stand by themselves. And so we usually recommend a mix of synchronous and asynchronous. And we like to think about it as, if you're going to take the time and energy to have a live online meeting, we want that meeting to drive offline follow-up learning that learners do independently. And the reverse could also be true. Maybe you have some offline follow-up learning that you had the kids do, but it wasn't follow-up, it was first. So you had them do offline learning, and then that drove the live meeting topic. So maybe they read something and now you're going to talk about it. But the most important thing is to realize that those gears are interacting with each other all the time. And everything that they do asynchronously influences how they are live, and everything they do live influences what they do when they're offline. So thinking about those two things really together, driving each other, those are important pieces. So we're going to pause for a minute and actually use a feature in Zoom called a breakout room. And Patrick's going to jump folks to a breakout room. And while you're in there, go ahead and just introduce yourself real quick and share your name, your school, or your district, what classes you teach. And then any thoughts you have about what we covered today. And if any other needs come up that people are sharing, make note of that. And when we come back to the main room, you can help us see some of those needs. So we'll jump you in there for about 4 minutes, and then we'll come back to the breakout to the main room, and then we'll wrap up our session. All right, welcome back, everyone. It's a very rough transition coming back to the main room after you're having a nice conversation. Yeah, we needed more time in our chat. Absolutely, we did. We tried to keep the session short, but it just goes to show you how when you're in these small group chats, it almost feels like you're, in the teacher's lounge together. And so really thinking about how we use those small group chats to build that kind of community. So after this webinar closes, we'll be sending a follow-up email with links to the webinar recording, if it's helpful to share that with anyone else, to both of those flyers that we talked about and that K-12 distance learning Google Doc. And those are public. So you may share those around any way that you want. There's also a link to a feedback survey. One, it helps Patrick and I get some feedback, but more importantly, there's a question in there about what other professional learning you think might be needed in the region. And that would be super helpful as we do some strategic planning with the Southwest REC and the PED and WestAd, really thinking about how we support your region. So it would be great to have feedback on that. And as an announcement later this week, we'll be rolling out a flyer for your region that's an outreach flyer for parents. And so it's focused on how parents and caregivers can support their children's emotional and mental health, as well as their academics during this time period. But it is really quite heavy on the social emotional dimension. So that flyer will be coming out. It will be English on one side, Spanish on the other, and it's available as a print flyer or a share around PDF. So if that is helpful in any of your outreach work with parents, that will be available shortly. If you want,
I'm sorry to cut in really quick. I'm also going to forward the link to register for tomorrow's session of the same webinar that you just experienced. So if you have colleagues that you think would benefit from a quick 30-minute primer on these ideas, you can forward that to them and they can still register for that event.
Okay, great. And if you want to stick around, we're going to do some casual Q&A afterwards. So if you have any specific questions about your context, about the programs you're using, any of those things, we are happy to stick around and answer some of those questions.